Okay, this is going to be our next part on the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg, and we're on the route to Cemetery Hill. On July 1st, 1863, between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m., the 20th New York State Militia, along with the rest of the 1st and 11th Corps of the Union Army, began the retreat through the town of Gettysburg toward Cemetery Hill. Most of the men, including Major Van Rensselaer, were completely exhausted. For over 1 hour, they had been on the run through a railroad cut and then southward through the town of Gettysburg, with Confederate troops hot on their trail. By the time the company got to East Cemetery Hill, Company I only had about 5 men left. Colonel Gates began to receive messages there regarding the men of his regiment, how they had become wounded or killed, and tears began streaming down his face. Now we're here because we don't know the exact route. It was somewhere between Stratton and Baltimore streets. It also mentions the troops going through alleys. So I'm taking a route to Cemetery Hill that's in between both of those routes that are basically taking some of the back alleys of Gettysburg. As the men raced through the streets and alleys of the town, the Confederate troops were right behind them. A lot of troops began to take possession, a lot of Confederate troops rather, began to take possession of the homes and climb into the upper levels and attics of those homes and use them as sharpshooting positions. So now the soldiers are trying to retreat and fire. They're being fired at by the overwhelming forces of the Confederate Army, and then certain sharpshooters are beginning to take aim at them using the protection of attics and high windows in houses. Besides that, Oak Hill, Seminary Ridge, Blotcher's Knoll that we know as Barlow's Knoll, and other heights were now under total Confederate control, and artillery rained down the iron on these retreating Union troops. The rallying point was Cemetery Hill. In our next video, we will take a look at where Cemetery Hill is, where the 20th New York State Militia met at Cemetery Hill, and where they were reunited with the two companies from the Emanuel Harmon Farm. Again, this is our next part on the 20th New York State Militia on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. This is our next part of the 20th New York State Militia on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. And again, as the troops now begin to head into this area of the town, today it's the area where Route 97 and Route 134, Steinware Avenue and the Baltimore Pike meet. At the time, there was the old Wagon Hotel that stood near here. We know that the troops passed the old Wagon Hotel at this very intersection, and they would head to the western slope of East Cemetery Hill, in which we are heading today. And remember, at this point, right about where we're at now, was the end of the Confederate occupation and the beginning of the rallying point of the Union infantry troops that were placed on Cemetery Hill. So at this point, they're a little bit safer. They're out of no man's land, and they're now entering the area that was occupied by a very small force of Union infantry of the 11th Corps. And we'll talk about that Union infantry under the command of Orland Smith in our next video. This has been the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg, here on their retreat through the town of Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, I am here on the Tawny Town Road, and I am here at the marker for Colonel Orland Smith and his 2nd Brigade of the 11th Corps, 2nd Division. And that brigade consisted of the 33rd Massachusetts, 136th New York, 55th, and 73rd Ohio Infantry. Now, as the men of the 20th New York State Militia raced through the streets and alleys of the town, as I said in the last video, Confederate troops were hot on their trail. The rallying point was Cemetery Hill. The rallying point for the 20th New York State Militia was right here in this area of Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill goes from here, and it would wrap around, as we're wrapping around now, by the annex of the cemetery, and then over in this area about a mile in the distance over there where the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse is in East Cemetery Hill. But the 20th New York State Militia would move here. Now again, around 5:30 in the evening of July 1st, 1863, the 20th New York State Militia arrived on Cemetery Hill to the men of Orland Smith's brigade. Now that brigade again was the 11th Army Corps, 2nd Brigade, 2nd Division, consisting of the 73rd Ohio. Their monument sits just over here inside the annex of the National Cemetery. The 55th Ohio's monument sits a little bit further down the road. The Massachusetts Regiment over here, and the 136th New York is there in the distance. In fact, the right flank marker is right there in front of the Reliance Mine Saloon. They arrived here at 5:30 in the afternoon of July 1st to the men of Orland Smith's brigade. Now, Orland Smith's brigade arrived last at Gettysburg, marching up this road, the Taneytown Road. They arrived here at 2 p.m. and they were too late to be rushed through the town to the north side of the town and get involved in the battle at Oak Hill. So they paused here on the western slope of the hill, and they were spectators to the first day's battle. And at that time, this cemetery, and I can post some pictures of the cemetery, a panoramic view that was taken around 1869, and you can see how there is absolutely nothing in this area except dotted with a few houses. So these men of Orland Smith watched the 1st and their own 11th Corps troops collapse on July 1st, 1863, as they were here safe on the western slope of Cemetery Hill. But they were the only sizable group on Cemetery Hill on that part of the evening of July 1st, and the rallying point for all Union troops, including the 20th New York State Militia. And when I mean all Union troops were wrapping around this hill. This would become what would become the Union fishhook position, which would then head southbound in that direction to the Round Tops. This is the beginning of the Union fishhook position right here where we stand at Orland Smith's brigade here. This has been the next part of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be our next part of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg, and we just talked about how the troops arrived here around 5:30 on the evening of July 1st, 1863 to the troops of Orland Smith's brigade. And again, now you can see the rest of the Union 1st and 11th Corps rushing into this area. Confederate troops are behind us through the town of Gettysburg. They've taken the town over, and now they have to begin the defense of this hill. About an hour and a half later, around 7 p.m., the 20th New York State Militia were ordered to bivouac on a farm along the Taneytown Road. Though the threat wasn't over, now the Union troops had heights, and they were beginning to dig in around the hill. This house on the left is the Catherine Gwynn farm, and this area where these cars are coming up here on the road was the Catherine Gwynn farm. And this field over here to our left is where the troops of the 20th New York State Militia bivouacked the night of July 1st, 1863. And that ends our first day battle with the 20th New York State Militia here at Gettysburg. And from this point on, it'll be all day 2 and day 3. In our next video, we're going to talk about Catherine Gwynn and the Catherine Gwynn farm. And we're going to be here in this field where the 20th New York State Militia encamped on July 1st into the July 2nd of 1863. This has been our next part of the 20th New York State Militia here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is the Catherine Gwynn farm, and also our next part of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. This was the farm of Catherine Gwynn. The farm dates back to about 1750, and though the house today is not the original house, the house was actually moved from one location to a different location around 1884. The farmland is what is important. The 20th New York State Militia encamped here on this field and this farm just on the southern end of East Cemetery Hill and also the Evergreen Cemetery on July 1st of 1863. They camped over here overnight into the morning and early afternoon of July 2nd. Now, Catherine Kate Gwynn was an elderly woman in her 70s at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, and she was quite a character. It was said, and it's also written in a book called The 151st Pennsylvania at Gettysburg by Michael Drees. It was said that she threatened, as an elderly woman, she threatened to beat up any soldier lurking near her house. Now, the 20th New York State Militia was not only lurking near her house, but they were on her farm. So, I'm sure she was not happy that Confederate troops were here, but she honestly didn't want any troops on her property. And today, this is the Catherine Gwynn house. There are remnants of the farm, and I don't know whether the foundations of the barn and house are the originals. I do know the house was moved, or turned at least, in the 1880s. And again, you can see the southern end of the National Cemetery over here. And this farm, though the National Cemetery was established during the Battle of Gettysburg, just on the other side of the National Cemetery is the Evergreen Cemetery. This farm is also directly across the street from the Lydia Leicester house, which we did a video on, was also known as General George Gordon Meade's headquarters. So this area was basically the command center of the Union Army on July 2nd, 1863, when Meade arrives and the Union is now beginning the fishhook position. Again, I said that fishhook was just up the road, and we drove from Orland Smith's marker. That fishhook would extend all the way out in this area through here across Cemetery Ridge, and you can see Big Round Top and Little Round Top in the distance. This was the beginning of that fishhook on the evening of July 1st and 2nd, 1863. And the 20th New York State Militia in this field today, and ironically enough, this field for years and years and years was used, and still sometimes is, on bigger holidays like the 4th of July, used as the overflow parking lot for the National Cemetery and also for the Visitor Center or any special events that they got going on. And I'm sure when people park their cars, as I've done here today, that most people see this empty field and don't realize what significance it played a role in. It was here on the Catherine Gwynn farm. It was directly across the street from General Meade's headquarters, but it was also the spot that the 20th New York State Militia encamped and bivouacked on the evening of July 1st into July 2nd of 1863. This has been the next part of the 20th New York State Militia here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be our next part of the 20th New York State Militia here at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate, and we are now on July 2nd, 1863, somewhere around noon, and the 20th New York State Militia was marched from the Gwynn farm southbound along the Taneytown Road. Now, of course, the farm that you see in front of us is the house of the widow Lydia Leicester, which would later become General Meade's very own headquarters. And this farm, we did a video series on it. You'll want to go back and watch that video. But that was the command center of the Union Army on July 1st of 1863. And this would have probably been one of the first things that the men of the 20th New York State Militia seen as they began their march southbound along the Taneytown Road. And we're going to follow that route of march now. They would go southbound here, and they would next pass by the Peter Fry farm, and that's going to be up here on our right hand side. You're going to see the barn first and then the stone house. Little did the men know that the next day that both of these farms would take direct fire from the artillery barrage that would precede Pickett's charge. And this is the Peter Fry barn and house here to our right as we pass by. The 20th New York State Militia would march in this direction. Before turning to the right, there was a small farm lane here on the right hand side that they would turn at and then head toward Cemetery Ridge, and that would be right about here where this gate is that we just passed. So this has been our next video of the 20th New York State Militia at Gettysburg on Gettysburg